Hi everybody, Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. We're in the month of Adar, the month of Simcha, and I hope that all of you and all of Klal Yisrael and really everybody should be blessed with a great deal of joy, even though the world is still going through difficult times. It's been a little more than a year, really. Last Purim was when a lot of the lockdowns started, and we're still kind of in the middle of it. And B'ezrat Hashem, we should have a Yeshua. Today's shir is dedicated in honor of the memory of the Yahrtzeit of Shlomo ben Hevel on the 6th of Adar. And may our learning be an Aliyot Neshamah. And also, once again, we are dedicating the learning for Refuah Shelema, for Binyamin Yisroel ben Chanita, a young man that we have been praying for quite a few weeks, and he should have a Refuah Shelema, as well as Yonantan Yechezkel ben Irit. And for both of them, they should have a Refuah Shelema b'toch shar Chol Yisrael, and the words of Torah should be of benefit to them and all of the Jewish people that are suffering illness. Today I'm going to depart a little bit from the Parsha of the week and really talk about, I'm going to go a little backwards and a little forwards, and that is, in the month of Adar, the Chachamim, the sages, enacted that there are 4 special Shabbos readings. Now, they don't replace the regular Torah reading. We read the Parsha of the week every week, but as a maftir, as an additional final reading, we have a special reading for 4 weeks, and the Haftorahs always match up with that special final Torah reading. So, for example, you're going to find that for these 4 Parshiot, the Haftorah is not going to be a Haftorah that is connected to the Parsha of the week, but it'll be connected to the special reading. And this is called simply Arba Parshiot, the 4 special Parshas, the 4 special Torah readings. We had the first one last Shabbos, and we have the next one this Shabbos, and then we'll have 2 more after that until the Rosh Chodesh Nisan. I want to start off with talking about last week's, and then I'm going to talk about this week's, because, well, let me first enumerate the 4 Parshiot generally, so you'll have a sense of what the map is, and then we'll be more specific and more detailed. The 4 Parshiot are, number 1, Parshat Shekalim. This is a Torah reading about the mitzvah of giving the half shekel, and that is always on either the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar, or, as in this year when Rosh Chodesh Adar is Shabbos, we read Parshat Shekalim. The Shabbos before Purim, which happens to be this coming Shabbos, because Purim is on Shabbos, is Parshat Zachor. It deals with the mitzvah to remember and eradicate Amalek. And of course, Haman is from Amalek. The third Parsha, which is already in preparation for the Passover Korban, is Parshat Para, the Parsha of the red heifer, whose ashes are used to purify us from Tumat Meis. And the fourth Parsha, which will be Rosh Chodesh Nisan, is Parshat HaChodesh, that deals with all of the laws of the Korban Pesach. So in a sense, it breaks down into a very symmetrical division. Shekalim and Zachor are precursors to Purim, and Para and Chodesh are precursors to Pesach. You'll see why. Shekalim and Zachor are going to be connected to Purim. Para, Chodesh are connected to Pesach. So we're not going to be talking about Para and Chodesh right now, because after all, we are coming to the holiday of Purim, and therefore we will focus on Shekalim and Zachor. What is the mitzvah? A little bit of information first. What is the mitzvah of machzis ha-shekel, of giving a half shekel? By the way, the half shekel of the Torah is a lot more than an Israeli half shekel. Don't confuse it. The korbanos of the Beis Hamikdash and of the Mishkan in the desert had to be publicly financed. A person couldn't say, like yeshivos say, "Oh, I'm dedicating all of the service in the Beis Hamikdash today." Couldn't do it. Korbanos have to come from Klal Yisrael. If you want to bring your own sin offering, your own burnt offering, you bring your korban. That's your money. But the korbanos that were brought on behalf of Am Yisrael, the korban tamid, the daily sacrifice, the musaf offerings on Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, and Yom Tov, the burning of the incense, the lighting of the menorah oil every single day, that could not come from private donations. That had to come from a tax that was levied on all of the Jewish people to the tune of a half a shekel a year. A half a shekel a year was essentially your tax in order to purchase the necessary korbanot, including incense and menorah oil, that was used in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the second point to know is that the Beis HaMikdash had a fiscal year, just like any company has to have a fiscal year. And the fiscal year of the Beis HaMikdash did not begin on Rosh Hashanah. The fiscal year of the Beis HaMikdash began Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which in the Torah is always described as the first month. By that I mean, starting from Rosh Chodesh, any korbanos that you're bringing from Rosh Chodesh Nisan onwards has to come from newly collected money that was collected for that specific year. Meaning, even if there was a surplus, even if last year's shkalim were left over, because let's say the price of animals went down, and we do have money in the temple treasury from last year's collections that could buy the new korbanot, you're not allowed to use that old money. In fact, the Mishnah in Masechet Shkalim, there's a whole tractate in the Mishnah about the Machzis HaShekel. In fact, there's no Babylonian Talmud on it, but there's a Yerushalmi on it. That's why, for those of you who may be learning Daf Yomi, I don't know if any listeners are Daf Yomi people, this is the only part of the Daf Yomi cycle that actually learns Talmud Yerushalmi rather than Bavli, because there is no Talmud Bavli in Masechet Shkalim. But the Mishnah is like almost a manual of accounting. It talks about what do you do with surpluses? What do you do with surplus Shkalim that cannot be carried over into the new year? So as a result, when Rosh Chodesh Nisan came, there had to be new money in the temple treasury that was collected for this new fiscal year. So as a result, even though people paid their half shekels in the course of a whole year, there had to be something there to start the process off. So as a result, the Chachamim enacted that we start collecting the shkalim of the new year 1 month before Nisan, which happens to be Rosh Chodesh Adar, and therefore the first line of the Mishnah is Bi-echad bi-Adar mashmi'in al shkalim. On the first day of Adar, we make an announcement, time to contribute the half shekel. Now, again, I want to emphasize, not everybody paid their taxes on time. Plenty of people paid late. They paid 6 months later, 8 months later, 10 months later, and there were even people that we had to enforce, right? We had the equivalent of the halachic IRS that would, or the treasury, the Otzar, that would go and collect the taxes. But at least by starting in Adar, that ensured that there would be a critical mass of shkalim. So as a result, therefore, Zecher LeMikdash, to commemorate what was done in the Beis HaMikdash, we read about the half shekel, the Shabbos of Rosh Chodesh Adar. It's a Zecher LeMikdash based on Biachad Bi'Adar Mashmi'an Al Shkalim. For those of you that are students of the Christian Bible, the very, very famous scene of Jesus overturning the money changers in the temple. You know, the money changers were not such bad guys as Jesus perhaps portrayed them. They were there to exchange foreign currencies into the half shekel, meaning to say, if I was a Jew from Spain or France or whatever country I came from, like Babylonia, and I didn't necessarily have the local half shekel currencies to be able to donate to the temple, so I would come with my foreign currencies, and the money changers would give me the necessary half shekel, minus the commission that they would take. Okay, you know, it's a way of making a living. You know, money changers have to make a living too. But Jesus was upset with the commercialization of what was going on, but I think he well understood, as a Jew with a Torah background, he well understood that there actually was a legitimate function for the money changers in the temple as well.
Didn't he accuse them of exchanging dishonestly?
Yeah, that was part of the you know, excessive commissions and whatever it is, are not giving you value for your money. You know, I don't have, obviously, other than that single account in the Christian Bible, we don't really have any particular record of how widespread that dishonesty was. But yeah, I mean, obviously that was always a potential. So that's Machzis HaShekel. Now, directly, that is not connected to Purim. I said a few moments ago that Shkalim is a precursor to Purim, but based on the description I just gave you, you don't see that I'm going to come back to why that's so. Zachar, Amalek, is very, very clearly connected to Purim because under the tradition that we have, Haman is actually a descendant of Amalek. If you remember the story, when King Saul, when Shaul HaMelech is given a commandment to eradicate Amalek, Shaul carries out the job 99% of the way, but he does not kill the king of Amalek, who is called Agag. And Agag is eventually killed by the prophet Shmuel. Shmuel himself kills Agag. And that's what the book of Shmuel tells us. But in rabbinic tradition, Agag managed to escape for a little bit of while, and he impregnated a woman. And when Agag was killed, the woman who was pregnant was still alive, and she gave birth to a baby, and eventually the descendant of that baby was none other than Haman. And that's why the Megillah calls him Haman Ha'agagi, Haman the Agagite, and Agag is none other than the king of Amalek. That's even the Makor, the Ramah says, of the well-beloved children's, everyone should do it, but children love the custom of making noise when Haman's name is said. You bang and you stamp your foot, and that's based on kind of eradicating the memory of Amalek. So that's obviously connected to Purim because Purim is a celebration in part of the triumph over the forces of evil that Amalek represents. But what does Shekalim have to do with Purim? Is it just a coincidence, so to speak, that Rosh Chodesh Adar is the month of Purim and that's when they started collecting Shekalim? So let me call to your attention a statement of the great Amora Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, Galui v'yadua lefnei mi she'amar v'haya ha'olam. It was known before God is referred to as the one who said and brought the world into existence, that Haman would try to destroy the Jews by giving Achashverosh shekels. That's recorded in the Megillah. That when Haman wanted to get the right, so to speak, to kill the Jewish people, and he had all of his arguments why they're not worthy and they deserve to die, he actually wanted to give Achashverosh an immense amount of silver. Aseret alafim kikar kesef. 10,000 talents of silver. Now a kikar is a weight of silver that's over 100 pounds. I don't have the exact number, but it's over 100 pounds. 10,000 talents. That's a million pounds of silver. Achashverosh, in his generosity, turned down the offer. He said, no, you can do it for free. Okay, great. But nevertheless, Haman tried to get us via Shekalim. So God wanted to anticipate and negate the power of Haman's shekels. So he gave us a mitzvah where we give our shekels before Haman gave his shekels. Haman gave his shekels to kill us on the 13th of Adar, right? That was Haman's designated day. Hashem gives us a mitzvah of shekel on the 1st of Adar, which is earlier than Haman's shekels, and therefore our shekels countermand, negate, minimize the power of Haman's shekels. And that is why Reish Lakish concludes, on the 1st of Adar, we announce the mitzvah of Machzos HaShekel to countermand the Sheklei Haman. Now, this passage, this statement, is a very enigmatic statement. It's very hard to logically understand what's going on. First of all, what does it mean that we are countermanding Haman's shekels? I mean, Haman is long gone. Haman was hung. Haman is not here. In what way do we continually need to countermand Haman's shekels? And second of all, how are you countermanding it? I mean, the shekalim of Haman were given, or at least he offered to give them to Achashverosh, and our shekalim we give to Hashem. We're not directly countermanding it. What is the shaychus? What is the connection between the shekalim that we give and the shekalim that Haman wanted to give? And what is the need that you're countermanding by the mitzvah of machzas HaShekel. There seems to be an implication that the Shekelim of Haman represent a continual threat that we have to fight against, when from the Megillah it is simply an isolated historical event that happened and does not reoccur. So to understand this statement a little bit more deeply, we have to focus on a very well-known observation, and that is, although the book of Esther is part of the Bible, it is part of the Tanakh, it is a sanctified book, it does not contain the name of God. The name of God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, which is very, very unique. After all, the one thing that Tanakh is full of is, of course, mentions and references to the Almighty. In the book of Esther, there is no mention of Hashem. By the way, interestingly enough, in the Septuagint was the Greek translation, not only of the Torah. I mean, initially was only the Torah, and that's described in the Gemara about the 70 elders. In fact, Septuagint means the translation of the 70. The Gemara talks about their translation of the 5 books of Moses, but at later times there was a translation of the entire Tanakh, and for the most part, the Septuagint, called the Targum HaShivim, is more or less a literal translation, but there are some books in which they make some significant changes which are treated as non-canonical, meaning they're not treated as authoritative as part of the Masoretic text, but there are changes that they made, and one of them is that in their version of Megillat Esther, they have a prayer of Esther Hamalka in which she's praying to Hashem for deliverance, and they put in the name of God. So scholars debate which is the authentic version of Esther. Is it our version of Esther, which doesn't have the name of God, or is it the version of Esther that has the name of God? And they quite rightly conclude that it's more probable that the addition of the name of God was the later text and not the original, because the reason is quite logical. If you had a Megillat Esther that originally had the name of God, why would a later generation take it out? It makes no sense. Why would you make that change? If, on the other hand, you started off with a text that didn't have the name of God, for whatever reason, I'll try to give you a reason, then one could imagine that a later generation wanted to make it more religious, make it more frum, so to speak. So the Septuagint does add the name of God, but in our tradition that is not the original text. In other words, the original text of the book of Esther, which we read, of course, on Purim, does not mention the name of Hashem. Very peculiar. By the way, there's one other book that may not mention the name of Hashem. May not, because it's not so clear. And this is even stranger. This is Shir HaShirim. The Song of Songs does not mention the name of Hashem, although I'll mention one possibility that it does. Now, the Song of Songs, of course, is an example of very passionate romance between a man and a woman, and yet the rabbinic tradition we have is based on Rabbi Akiva. In fact, Shir HaShirim was almost banned from Tanakh, like banned in Boston. They didn't want to include it. They thought it was semi-pornographic. But Rabbi Akiva got it in. Rabbi Akiva argued, if all of the songs of the Tanakh are Kodesh, Shir HaShirim is Kodesh Kedashim, because it is a metaphor for the passionate love of God for the Jewish people. God is the shepherd, and the Jewish people are the princess. And all of the passionate midnight encounters are the desire of Hashem to come to us and redeem us, and our yearning for Hashem. But sometimes we play hard to get, like the woman says, I'm asleep, don't wake me up now, etc. Now, Shir HaShirim also does not mention the name of Hashem, except there's one word which is a little unclear. At the end of Shir HaShirim, it talks about even the greatest torrential waters cannot extinguish passionate love, which is Shalhavesya. Shalhavesya means it's like a burning torch. But the problem is, how do you deal with the last syllable? Is Shalhavesya one word or two words? If it's two words, Shalhevet Ka, a burning torch of God. So then you have the name of God. On the other hand, others understand Shalhavesya is just one word, and it's just a poetic form of the word Shalhevet, and it does not connote the name of God. So there is a machlokas if the name of Hashem is in Shir HaShirim. But that's only a machlokas with respect to Shir HaShirim. With respect to Megillas Esther, for sure the name of Hashem is not there. Now why is that so? Why is that so? So the general idea is because everything about the book of Esther, everything about the Purim story, is about the concealment of God. Because unlike Yetziat Mitzrayim, where God reveals himself in an open, supernatural way, a way that his presence cannot be denied, the 10 plagues, and the splitting of the Red Sea, and then in the desert, of course, the continuation of that, with the man falling from heaven, and the traveling well, and the clouds of glory, in which Hashem's presence is open and clear and undeniable. In the book of Esther, God is acting behind the scenes, so to speak. There is no open miracles in the book of Esther. In fact, if you analyze every single event in the book of Esther, if you would be a skeptic or a heretic or an atheist, Richard Dawkins could explain every event. He doesn't accept the historical accuracy anyway, but even if he would accept the historical story, he could explain it well within the bounds of atheism. Achashverosh kills Vashti? Well, sure, in the ancient world, kings killed their queens all the time. He happens to pick Esther. Somebody had to be picked. Esther happens to be positioned in the royal house so that when Haman wants to destroy her nation, she's there. Great, wonderful coincidence. So Purim is all about hiddenness, all about concealment. The idea that Hashem is behind the scenes even when you don't necessarily notice him. And it's only when you look at all the pieces in retrospect that you see how Hashem is running the world. The very word Esther, her name, is connected to Hester. Hester is concealment, right? Hester Panim. That's why, of course, the book of Esther is a diaspora festival, right? The miracle of the book of Esther occurred primarily in Chutz La'aretz, not in Eretz Yisrael, because in Galut, Hashem's relationship to us is here, but it's more of a hidden relationship. It's not as open as it is in Eretz Yisrael. Even today, Eretz Yisrael, you see the Hashgacha a bit more, but certainly when there was a Beis HaMikdash, there was much more of a Giloi, much more of a revelation. So Purim is very important because it reminds us that even in hiddenness, we have to look for the divine. And that's an important lesson. Don't think that divinity is only when you have open, miraculous, supernatural manifestations. Even the minhag of wearing a mask. Now, of course, this year I understand that mask wearing on Purim is not so clear exactly. What are you going to do? What are you going to do on Purim different than you're doing today? We've been wearing masks the whole year, but okay. So on Purim we'll get a special Purim mask, and in many ways, this whole year was kind of an experience of Purim, to see the light of Hashem, even when things are dark and things are difficult and things are challenging. That's a different level of concealment. That's not the concealment of coincidence, but that's the concealment of suffering, adversity. That's a different type of concealment. And that's what a mask is. A mask covers up the inner reality. So this is a well-known idea that I'm sure many of you have heard before, that the name of Hashem is not in Megillat Esther, but the Zohar says that even when the name is not explicitly mentioned, it is encoded in references to Melech, that when the Pasuk talks about the Melech, there is a double entendre, there is a double meaning. There is the flesh and blood guy who's called Achashverosh, and then there's Melech, Malchei Hamlachim, the king of all kings, that is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a double conversation. So to give you one example of how this is so dramatic, the turning point of the Megillah, when things begin to get better, is chapter 7, Perek Zayin, when Achashverosh cannot sleep that night, and he calls his secretaries to read his chronicles, and then he discovers he didn't reward Mordechai for informing him of the assassination plan. That's literally the turning point when, until that point, Haman is at the ascendancy, everything he wants, he's getting done, and this is the beginning of the decline. And that's why even the Baal Koreh reads it in a very dramatic way. Balayla hahu, and that night, nadada shinas hamelech, the sleep of the king was restless. It is literally the turning point. So the Zohar says it has two meanings. Achashverosh couldn't sleep, and there's a reference to the verse in Tehillim, Hine lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. Behold, the guardian of Israel does not slumber, does not sleep. Hashem in Shamayim is finally saying, I'm going to take charge of this situation and change it for the good. Double meaning. Which means every pasuk in which Melech is mentioned, you have kind of a lower meaning and a higher meaning. Lower meaning is human king Achashverosh. Higher meaning is something's happening in Shamayim that God is saying. So now let's apply this to the conversation that Haman has with Achashverosh. Vayomer Haman, right? Haman is trying to make the case. After all, even Achashverosh wouldn't normally want to destroy a whole nation that's paying taxes and everything else. So Haman has to make the case, without even identifying that he's talking about the Jews, that the Jewish people ought to just get rid of him. So it says, Vayomer Haman lamelech. Haman says to the Melech, Yeshna yam echad. There is this nation, Mefozer mefored bein ha'amim. They are scattered and separated among all of the nations of your empire. Daseyim shonot, this is in the Megillah, Daseyim shonot mikolam. Their laws are different than everybody else's laws. Strange customs, they don't fit. V'yastasei hamelech ein hamosim. And the laws of the king, they don't fulfill. V'lamelech ein shovel lahanicham. And it's not worth the king's energy to sustain them. It's not worth it. Get rid of them. Now, let's analyze this on the lower level and the upper level. The lower level is classic anti-Semitic tropes that have been used throughout history, and that is, Haman is making a case. Number one, Jews are scattered all over the place. Now, that has two implications. Number one, they're like a cancer in all societies, that every society is infiltrated with these Jews all over the place. Number two, there's a strategic point that because they're not concentrated in one place, they don't have a critical mass to be able to fight your army. So it would be easy to get rid of them because they're not in one place. And then he goes on and he says that their laws are different than all other laws. And the Gemara gives examples that Haman is saying they have less respect for you than for a fly. Because if a fly falls into their wine, they take out the fly and drink the wine. If you touch, you the king, you're a guy, if you touch the wine, they got to throw it away. So you're worse than an insect. And then Haman makes the argument. Every time he asks a Jew to do something, he always has this holiday excuse. Oh, can't do it, it's Shabbos, can't do it, it's Pesach, can't do it. No matter what happens. Every day seems to be a holiday, right? One way or the other. So Haman is basically saying they're unproductive, they don't keep the laws, they don't respect you, they're like a cancer infiltrating society, and they don't have a critical mass that could really fight you anyway, so it would be easy just to get rid of them one by one by one. Right? Anti-Semite, right? Haman makes the case. But mystically, you have to understand that just as there's an earthly Haman who is trying to convince an earthly king, this same conversation is happening in Shamayim with the spiritual evil force that Haman represents, i.e. Amalek, arguing to God that the Jews are not deserving of redemption. And we don't always realize this. We don't always realize that Purim was a near calamity. It was not a done deal that we would survive. In fact, the Gemara in Megillah actually says that spiritually, we were nitchayev kaliyah. We were deserving of destruction. And Haman's monologue is translatable to what we might call a kitrug. A kitrug is an accusation in Shemayim. So now let's look at it this way. The first thing Haman on earth said was, Mefozar u'meforad bein ha'amim, scattered and dispersed. Haman meant simply that the Jews are not concentrated in one place, so there's no critical mass. That's what Haman meant. But the celestial dialogue is, they are divided and dispersed among themselves. There is no unity. There is sinat chinam. There is pirud, mefozar, umeforad. Dosei hamelech eina mosum. They don't keep the king's laws, i.e. they don't keep the Torah, the laws of the king. So it turns out that in Shamayim, one of the very first kitrug, the accusation, the very first charge against the Jewish people was polarization, dissension, disunity, sinat chinam. That was our Achilles heel, as it always is our Achilles heel. To borrow a Greek metaphor, that was our weakness. That was our pagam. That was our vulnerability. That was the basis in Shamayim why we were deserving of destruction. That is why, when Mordechai hears of Haman's decree that on 13th of Adar the Jews are to be wiped out, and he runs to Queen Esther to tell her to intervene. So the first thing, Esther said to him was, go and gather all the Jews and they should fast for 3 days. And that, of course, is the origin of the fast of Esther. Now note, though, that she didn't just say, tell the Jews to fast. She prefaced it with the phrase, go and gather all the Jews. That's a phrase that connotes unity and togetherness, meaning, if our weakness is mefozar meforad bein ha'amim, we can only overcome that weakness with the opposite force of lech kanos es kol haYehudim. And that is also the reason that when we were finally redeemed, and Chazal established a holiday in commemoration of that great salvation, the holiday of Purim. So the mitzvahs of Purim involve many gestures of unity and togetherness. Mishloach manot, sending food from one person to another. Giving charity to those in need. All of that is about reaching out beyond our egotism, beyond our selfishness, to embrace others, to connect to others. Now that's important the whole year, but the reason why it has such a prominence for Purim is because that is the tikkun, that is the rectification of mefuzar meforad bein ha'amim, is lech kanos es kol haYehudim, and mishloach manot ish l'reyehu, the sending of food, matanos li'avyonim. In fact, that's even the origin of the idea. That, again, this year things are obviously going to be a little different. But in normal times, when you send mishloach manot, so I give you a food basket, let's say, but the custom is, I don't give it to you directly, I try to get a shaliach. I get, usually a kid, I get somebody to bring it to you on my behalf. So it doesn't just go from A to B, but there's a C, there's a middleman who's supposed to bring it. Now, why is that such a custom? Because since the idea of shalach manot is to increase friendship and camaraderie and caring, you try to get more people involved. So it's not just me to you, but I get another person involved who brings it, because that's called marbe reyut. Marbe reyut is the increasing of friendship. In fact, this is an interesting discussion, but many say one should endeavor to give shalach manos to somebody with whom you're not necessarily so close, as a way of creating closeness. I just want to warn people that can backfire, because if somebody knows you're giving shalach manos to them because you don't really consider them so close, they may be very offended. So you got to be careful. These types of things have to be undertaken with a great deal of common sense and thinking about the repercussions. Okay, but be it as it may, therefore, allegorically, metaphorically, the kitrug of Haman might be described as the heavenly shkalim that Haman is using to convince God to destroy the Jewish people. Again, on earth, Haman wanted to give Achashverosh silver. But the way you translate that in the heavenly conversation is the purchase price to eradicate the Jewish people is pointing out their flaws, their chesronos, their mefozer meforad. that is called, in other words, that's a very poetic, allegorical description, but that can actually be called the shekels of Haman. Seen in that light, the shekels of Haman are not a historical event that happened once, but in every generation, every day, there are kitrugim. Every day, God has to make a decision to stick with us because of sinas china, mafozer mefored. So now we understand that Reish Lakish is quite accurate in talking about the shiklei Haman that continue to operate. But now, let's look at the first part of the statement. So the machzis ha-shekel is somehow a countermanding of the shiklei Haman. Why is that so? So let's focus on the machzis ha-shekel for a moment. When the Torah gives the mitzvah of machzis ha-shekel, again, and let me repeat that that's a lot more money than the modern half shekel, the Torah has an interesting requirement that it must be a uniform contribution. It mentions ha'osher lo yarbe. A rich person is not allowed to give more, and a poor person is not allowed to give less. Everybody must give equal. Now I understand why a poor person cannot give less. There's such a thing as a minimum requirement. Listen, there's a you want to participate in the service of the temple, there is a minimum requirement. If you have to borrow, you have to borrow, but there is a minimum requirement. But why would there be a rule that if I could afford more, I'm not allowed to do it? Why not? Rest assured, yeshivos charge tuition. And a lot of people do get scholarships. But if I'm a parent and I'm able to give more than full tuition, rest assured that every yeshiva in the world is going to take it. No yeshiva is going to say, sorry, you can't give more. Who says that? And yet, when it comes to the service of the temple, God says not only is there a minimum, but there's also a maximum. We're not going to take more from you. Why is that? So the Sfas Emes says a very beautiful idea. He says that when the Torah talks about rich people and poor people, it doesn't only mean rich in money and poor in money, but rich can refer to the whole spectrum of talents and abilities that people have. There are people who are rich in many, many ways. They're smart, they're fast, they're charismatic. I mean, not everybody has all of these things, but different people may have different sources of richness. People like them, they're good organizers, whatever it would be. These are people who have great wealth in many, many areas. And then there are people who seem to be, at least until you get to know them better, they seem to be bereft of a lot of talents. They seem to be poor. There's rich and poor in a lot of ways. Rich in wisdom, poor in wisdom. Rich in money, poor in money. Rich in abilities, poor in abilities. What the Torah is teaching me is this. When it comes to the service of God, because the temple is, of course, emblematic of the service of God, rich and poor stand with equal dignity and access to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the reason is because God does not judge you based on the magnitude of your objective achievement. God judges you by how much of your abilities and talents have you given to Him. So the same way, even in charity, a poor person who gives $1 might be doing something greater than a super billionaire that gives $1,000. So too, the fact that one person is very, very talented and another person is less talented doesn't mean that the less talented has less of an access to God. Rather, everybody's graded on the curve of their individual abilities. The Mabit, who is a contemporary of Rav Yosef Karo, Rav Moshe ben Yosef Trani, gives a mashal, and this is not exactly the mashal, I don't remember the numbers he uses, but this is the basic idea. Let's imagine that you have a student, a yeshiva bacher, who's a great, great genius, and he's able to learn 100 blot of Gemara a day, which is phenomenal. 100 blot of Gemara a day. And he decides that He's so far ahead of everybody else, he's only going to do 50 blot a day. And then you have another person who struggles to do 1 blot a day, or 1 blot a week, or 1 blot a month. And we look at these two people, and we see one guy doing 50 blot a day. Basically, that means he finishes shots every month. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And the other person is struggling, and we say, well, he works hard, but he's not really accomplishing. The Mabit says, in Olam Haba, it'll be the other way around. The guy who learns 1 blot will get more Olam Haba than the one who does 50 blot. Why? Because one who does 50 blot is only giving Hashem 50% of his capacity, even though he's achieving many, many times more. And the one who's doing 1 blot, nobody gives 100%, but is giving closer to 100%. God grades you on how much of yourself you've given to him. In fact, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman says that this may be an explanation of an interesting passage in the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva. In Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam discusses the very fundamental concept of free will, one of the most fundamental concepts of Judaism, that God does not predetermine if you will be righteous or evil, but every person has the capacity of choice. And then the Rambam discusses Hashem hardening Paro's heart, very interesting questions, but as a general rule, we function with the concept of free will, and the Rambam argues that free will is a logical necessity for accountability and responsibility. Because if I were pre-programmed to behave a certain way and I couldn't override that, then by what justice could God hold me accountable for my offenses? And by what entitlement would I deserve reward or positive affirmation? So the whole reward and punishment system is predicated on free will. That's why, by the way, in modern society, where free will is under a lot of attack, especially based on genetic code, genetic markers and the like, there are actually some philosophical questions regarding criminal responsibility. Okay, that people are really discussing this. How could people ever be responsible for anything unless you accept free will? So all of that is beautiful, all of that is true, but the Rambam gives an example that seems a little bizarre. The Rambam says, every person can be as righteous as Moshe Rabbeinu. Now the problem is, that's a little hyperbolic. I understand, I could be righteous, I have free will, I'm not a victim of my circumstances, I can rise above my condition. All of that is wonderful and good and very, very important. But to be a Moshe Rabbeinu? Come on. No, that's not going to happen. So in what sense can the Rambam possibly make the claim? And not only logically won't it happen, but even textually, the Torah says there will never be a prophet as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. He was given talents and abilities that are beyond whatever any human being is going to get. And by the way, that's actually an article of faith, because that is actually the predicate of why the Torah of Moshe cannot be superseded by subsequent revelations to Jesus or Muhammad. The immutability of the Torah that the Rambam considers to be a principle of faith is predicated on the unique greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu, which cannot be replicated. Again, I'm not going to get into the proof of that assertion, and one could argue, well, who says? But certainly the formulation of the 13 principles of faith is precisely based on the absolute uniqueness of Moshe Rabbeinu. Because otherwise you'd have the argument that God could supersede the Torah by later revelations. So what does the Rambam mean when the Rambam says each person could be as great as Moshe Rabbeinu? So Rabbi Chanan Wasserman offers a beautiful interpretation. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman says that Moshe Rabbeinu is described in the beginning of the book of Yehoshua as Eved Hashem, the servant of God. What is the connotation of servant of God? So the Radak, Rav David Kimchi, one of the great commentators, said that this is calling to mind the halacha, Ma shekana eved kana rabba. That means whatever a slave acquires belongs to his master. If a slave finds $100 in the street, he might hide it, who knows, but legally, halachically, that's the master's property. Moshe was called Eved Hashem, the Radak says, because every single ability that he had was never for himself, It was always for the service and the glorification of God. Ma shekana, whatever he acquired, was for God. That's the Radak. So says Rav Elchanan, that's what the Rambam means when he says, every person could be like Moshe. My talents, my abilities are infinitesimally small compared to Moshe. But just as Moshe gave Hashem 100% of what he was, theoretically, we could aspire to give Hashem 100% of what we are, even though that 100% is so much smaller. And that is the lesson of Machzis HaShekel. Machzis HaShekel, in the emphasis on equality, says rich and poor stand before God with the same access, the same dignity, the same chance to connect to Hashem by giving the abilities that they have. Now, if you think about this, this is a refuah to the Sheqelim of Haman. If the Sheqelim of Haman are about disunity, machlokes, jealousy, rivalry, looking down at people, excluding people, because they're not important, the lesson of Machzis HaShekel says, everybody matters. Everybody counts. So the poor person has no reason to feel disparaged, and the rich person, however you define rich, has no reason to disparage, because everyone stands before Hashem. So that's what the Gemara means, that the Machzis HaShekel counteracts the Shiklei Haman. The Shiklei Haman are mefuzar meforad bein ha'amim. The Machzis HaShekel talks about the equality of rich and poor. Now, there's another aspect of the Machzis HaShekel that is somewhat connected. And not only is there an emphasis on uniformity of contribution, but also the idea that it's a fraction. You give a half a shekel, not a whole shekel. I know that Rabbi Poston referred to at the beginning of the shir, I don't think it was recorded, the Kli Yakor's famous observation that the dimensions of the Aron HaKodesh were fractional dimensions, because in Torah we should always feel we're lacking and we should seek more, and that's with respect to Torah. But with respect to the temple contribution, the Torah also says you give a half, not a whole. The implication of a half shekel is a half does not become a whole unless you combine it with another half. And the lesson therefore is, I need you, you need me. Without the togetherness, without the hiskashrut, we are defective. We are chaser. So there are two aspects here. The uniformity is the equality of dignity, and the half is the incompleteness without connecting to the other. You know, think about this, when you have, let's say, a spaceship, a rocket. Right? So a rocket has, millions of parts. And some of those parts are so essential, the motors or whatever it would be. And some might be, 50-cent screws that you get in a hardware store. And looking at it objectively, it's a piece of plastic, it's a metal screw, nothing. But if that little screw is not functioning properly, the whole thing can explode. In fact, that's happened. There have been a number of accidents over the decades of space travel in which things have been destroyed because of little pieces that were intrinsically insignificant, but they were absolutely necessary for the accomplishment of the mission. So yeah, in Klal Yisrael you'll have Gedolim, you'll have Rosh Hashivas, you'll have the people who accomplish so much in the world. And then maybe you have people who are not so prominent, not so public, but they fill a role that is every bit as essential. And there's no way to accomplish the mission of Am Yisrael without the participation of all of us in our fullness. That's why there's a famous teaching, the Zohar says, that there are 600,000 letters in a Sefer Torah, and there are 600,000 basic souls of the Jewish people that left Egypt, and each soul is connected to a letter in the Torah, and if a Torah is missing one letter, the whole Torah is puzzle. The whole Torah is puzzle. Again, we'll leave for another time the famous question that there are far less than 600,000 letters. There's only around 305,000 letters. That's a big margin of error. We'll leave that for another time. But the idea that if I'm not connected to my letter, it's not just me that's missing. The whole Torah is not in place. So let me end with a story of the famous musical conductor, prodigy, Arturo Toscanini. Some of you may have heard of him. He was in the 50s, 60s, and earlier. He was a very, very famous musician, composer, conductor, pianist, and he really was a musical prodigy. And a reporter wanted to interview him, and Toscanini said, "You can't talk to me because I don't feel well. My orchestra has a concert tonight. I'm not able to go, but I have to listen to it on the radio, and I need to concentrate, and I cannot be interrupted because I need to be sure that everything is right, and if anything goes wrong, I can't correct it then, but I'll be able to tell them what they need to work on later." So the reporter promised, "I won't say a word, I just want to watch you, I just want to observe how you listen to a musical piece." So he comes to Toscanini's apartment in Manhattan, and this is the 50s. So the Toscanini had these old radios. Remember these old giant radios? Maybe you've seen pictures of them. And the sound quality was not very good. But Toscanini has to listen to this symphony orchestra playing. And he closes his eyes in deep concentration for 2 hours. And at the end of the 2 hours, he opens his eyes. He shakes his head. He has a grimace on his face. And he says, "How come there are only 14 violins? There were supposed to be 15. Why was a violin missing?" And the reporter says, "This is unbelievable. Even if you would be at the concert, unless you counted the violins, how many people would notice the difference between 15 and 14 violins? And you're not even at the concert. You're hearing it on a radio where the quality isn't even so good. How do you know the difference?" So the reporter went to investigate this. He said, "This is not possible. You just made up this story to impress me." So he goes to the orchestra, to the hall, and he talks to the first violinist, the head violinist of the string group, and he says to the violinist, "Tell me, how many violins do you have in this section?" So the violinist said, "Well, normally we have 15, but right before the concert, one of the violinists called up and said he wasn't feeling well. So I figured the boss wasn't going to be here tonight, and nobody's going to know the difference. So I said, we'll go with 14. It's too hard to find a replacement at such short notice." And then he said, "Listen, nobody knows the difference." So the reporter says, "Well, one person did know the difference." And he goes back to Toscanini and he says, "I can't believe this. This is a miracle. Like, how are you able to see the difference between 14 and 15? So Toscanini said, "Listen, I know that the average person in the audience, even in the audience, didn't know the difference. And Kal v'chomer, listeners on TV or radio, didn't know the difference. But when you're the conductor, you know that every single person makes a difference. Every single person contributes to the beauty of the performance. And if that person isn't there, the performance is not as beautiful as it should be. So yeah, I notice, because everybody does matter." And this story, Toscanini was not Jewish, obviously, but this story is a beautiful mashal to the Almighty, who is the conductor of the symphony of the universe. And in that symphony of the universe, there are so many things that seem to be little, insignificant. People who we don't necessarily see, the great need, the great contribution. Even animals, even plants, even insects, in ways we don't understand. And we have to know that to God, everything matters. Everyone makes a difference. Everyone is important. Everyone has their contribution. And when that contribution is not there, is not forthcoming, then the beauty of the symphony is impaired. And that is the lesson of Machzis HaShekel, that without our connection to each other, there is something that is missing. And that is how The Machzas HaShekel countermands and counteracts the Sheqel Haman. The Shkelem of Haman, Mefozar, Meforad, Bein Ha'amim, disunity and polarization. The Machzas HaShekel, unity, togetherness, equality of dignity, and recognition that without my connection to the other, I am going to be defective. But it goes both ways, you have to understand. Without my connection to you, I am defective. I need you. So that's an antidote to arrogance. But it also gives me strength because you need me. In other words, it both raises the spirits of the brokenhearted and it lowers the arrogance of the Balgaiva because we need each other. So I wish everybody, I guess we'll have one more class before Purim, but as we approach Parsha Zohar, when we talk about the eradication of Amalek, Hasidic Svarim tell us that there's also an Amalek within us, meaning when we think about destroying Amalek, it does have a halachic application to a certain enemy, but we don't know who that enemy is, so practically we don't apply that today. So the relevance of the mitzvah for us is much more of an internal process to destroy the Amalek within. The Amalek within is selfishness, it's egotism, it's hatred. And if we want to defeat the Amaleks in the outside world, we have to start with defeating the Amalek within us. And only when we achieve the victory of the Amalek within will Hashem give us the protection from the Amalek without. So Shabbat Shalom and Kol Tov.
Yeah.